Beneath the stories we know, there may be a truth we've never truly understood. For centuries we've heard tales of gods descending from the heavens, of beings who taught the people secrets of civilization, how to build, how to heal, how to navigate the stars. But what if these gods weren't gods at all? What if they were survivors, remnants of a lost civilization, trying desperately to guide humanity through the wreckage of a world that no longer existed? As you lie here, listening, imagine the possibility these stories passed down for millennia may not be the product of imagination, but of memory fragmented and distorted over time. History, as we've been taught, presents a picture of gods and myth. But what if that picture has been painted over a much darker, much more compelling truth? Every culture, from ancient Greece to Sumer to Mesoamerica, speaks of these figures, beings who arrived from the skies, taught vital knowledge, and then disappeared, leaving behind nothing but their teachings and the remnants of their once great presence. The ancient Greeks spoke of the Titans and their divine rule. The Sumerians wrote of the Anunnaki, while the ancient civilizations of the Americas told stories of the feathered serpent gods who gifted them agriculture, writing, and architecture. All of them share one striking commonality: beings who came from above, altered the course of human history, and then vanished, leaving only the faintest traces of their existence behind. But what if these gods weren't divine? What if they were the last survivors of a civilization that existed long before the rise of the societies we call ancient? What if these figures were simply people, or beings struggling to make sense of their past, speaking in a language that could be understood only through the lens of myth and legend? History has told us these gods are to be worshipped, to be feared, and to be revered, but in reality they may have been something far more human. They may have been survivors of a cataclysmic event, a world-altering disaster that wiped out a great civilization and left only those with knowledge of the past to navigate a new, unfamiliar world. They weren't divine beings with omnipotent powers. They were simply men and women, or perhaps something else entirely, carrying the memories of a world lost to time. When you think about it, doesn't this make sense? How else could ancient cultures, separated by vast distances, speak of nearly identical figures who came from the sky, bringing knowledge and civilization with them? Could it be that these myths aren't just the result of collective imagination, but the distorted memories of a time when the world was far more advanced than we could ever imagine? Could it be that these gods were survivors, carrying the last vestiges of a forgotten civilization? These are not conclusions we can answer tonight, but the seeds are there, waiting to be planted, waiting for us to see the faint outlines of a story we've never truly understood. The myths we've cherished for so long begin to look very different when we consider that perhaps they were never meant to be simply stories at all. Instead, they may be our ancestors' attempt to preserve the memory of a lost time, a time that, perhaps, we can never fully grasp. As you rest here, letting this thought linger, you're standing at the edge of something ancient and profound. The world we think we know is suddenly not as certain as we once believed. History, like a story told by the firelight, has a way of shifting, of blurring, and once you begin to see these myths in a different light, through the lens of survivors rather than gods, nothing about ancient history will ever feel the same again. And yet, we still don't have all the answers. But that is where the journey begins. And in the next section, we will start to unravel why so many different cultures across the globe tell eerily similar stories of these beings who descended from the heavens, bringing knowledge with them, before vanishing again. What were they really trying to tell us? What were they trying to preserve, if not a history lost to the sands of time? We've only scratched the surface, and the path ahead promises even more mysteries. Across the ages, scattered civilizations, separated by vast oceans and deserts, have told eerily similar stories. Stories of divine or semi-divine beings descending from the heavens, bringing knowledge, order, and civilization to primitive peoples. From the fertile crescent of Sumer to the sun-scorched plains of Egypt, to the sacred lands of the Hopi in the Americas, the same fundamental narrative echoes through the centuries. Ancient gods, beings of great power, wisdom, and often unimaginable beauty, arrived to teach the people how to live, how to build, and how to survive. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, leaving their teachings and sometimes mysterious monuments behind. These myths aren't isolated to one culture, nor are they the result of chance. If you listen closely, you can hear the consistency in the stories that span the globe. The Anunnaki of Sumer, the Titans of Greece, the Neteru of Egypt, and the Star People of the Hopi all share strikingly similar motifs. Beings descending from the sky, beings who brought advanced knowledge and sometimes warnings. How could it be that cultures so distant, with no means of communication, tell such strikingly similar stories? How could these beings be so familiar across oceans and centuries? The patterns begin to form a puzzle that only the truly curious dare to solve. What if these gods weren't mythic figments of imagination, but instead real figures from a distant past, remembered and mythologized across cultures? The ancient peoples had no words for spacecraft or advanced technologies. They had no understanding of the terms we would use today. So, they turned to the language of gods and myths to describe what they saw. A shining object in the sky. It could only be a divine being descending from above. A glowing light in the distance. It must be the work of the gods. The Anunnaki, the gods of Sumer, are perhaps one of the most well-known of these sky arrivals. According to their myth, these beings came from the heavens and granted humanity the knowledge of agriculture, writing, and mathematics. Similar stories appear in Egypt, where the Neteru, the gods of the ancient Egyptians, are said to have imparted the wisdom of architecture, healing, and astronomy. The Greek Titans, too, were believed to have once ruled the earth, bringing civilization with them before their fall. Across the world, the Ho people speak of the Star People who descended from the sky to teach humanity how to live in harmony with the world. These beings are always described as coming from above, as if descending from the heavens to provide a gift to humanity, a gift of survival, of knowledge, and of civilization. And yet, despite the distance between these cultures, despite the vast oceans, mountains, and time that separated them, their stories all share this same theme. How could this be? It's a question that, once posed, demands an answer. If these cultures never met, if there was no common link between them, why do their myths align so perfectly? How could the same story appear across continents, pass down for generations, and still retain the same core elements? This isn't a coincidence. The similarities across these mythologies are too precise, too consistent to be brushed aside as mere chance or coincidence. There is something deeper at play, something hidden beneath the surface of ancient history. These myths may not be simple legends after all. They may be fragments of an ancient, shared history, passed down through the veil of time and distortions. Could these stories be the remnants of a lost civilization? One that spanned the globe, bringing knowledge to the people who would later mythologize their teachings into the gods we worship today. As we stand on the precipice of this question, we find ourselves asking more than just why these myths exist. We begin to wonder whether these gods were really what we think they were. Were they divine beings, or survivors of an ancient, advanced civilization that fell long before recorded history? Were they people, or beings, from a time we can no longer comprehend? What we've been told about history, what we've been taught, might be far from the whole truth. In the next section, we'll explore how these shared myths might point to a civilization far older than we have been led to believe. A civilization that predates mainstream timelines and hints at something far more profound than we've ever imagined. The question is no longer just about the gods, it's about us, about humanity's place in a much older story, one that may rewrite everything we think we know about our origins. Could there be a truth, hidden beneath layers of time and myth, waiting to be uncovered? The mysteries of the past are not as distant as they may seem, and the answers are closer than you might think. The world is filled with wonders, mysteries, that linger beneath the surface of history, waiting to be acknowledged. As we look around us, through the lens of textbooks, theories, and dates, we see the grand structures of ancient civilizations. Pyramids, megaliths, and towering stone walls, all seemingly beyond the capabilities of the cultures that supposedly built them. How could such magnificent feats have been accomplished by people with tools so primitive, with knowledge so basic? The more we examine these monuments, the more we are forced to confront a question that doesn't easily fade. Why does our planet contain structures that are older and smarter than our accepted timeline allows? Take the Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance. Standing at the center of Egypt's ancient civilization, it is an enduring mystery in itself. The precision of its construction is astounding. The alignment with the stars and cardinal directions is so accurate that modern surveyors and engineers still marvel at it. Yet, The tools available to those who supposedly built it, copper chisels, simple hammers, barely seem capable of achieving such perfection. How could the Egyptians, or any civilization, have achieved such an engineering marvel with what we are told were primitive technologies? But the pyramids are not the only examples. Around the world we find similar structures: Stonehenge in England, the megalithic ruins of Baalbek in Lebanon, and the extraordinary city of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, all of them presenting similar puzzles. The stones at Baalbek, for example, are so massive, some weighing over 1,000 tons, that even the most advanced modern cranes can barely move them. Yet, ancient builders managed to position these stones with an accuracy and technique that seems incomprehensible given the tools they had. Then, there's the enigma of astronomical alignments. Ancient monuments from the pyramids to the temples of Angkor Wat align perfectly with celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, distant stars, in ways that could only be achieved with an advanced understanding of astronomy. Yet, these societies did not possess telescopes or modern instruments. They had no concept of planets beyond their own. Yet somehow, they mapped the heavens with precision that we might expect only from a civilization centuries ahead of its time. How did they know? What kind of knowledge did they possess that we no longer have, or perhaps that we have simply forgotten? These questions take us deeper into a world where ancient civilizations may not have been as primitive as we have been led to believe. What if these civilizations were not the starting point of history, but rather the remnants of something older, something far more advanced, something that has been lost to time, perhaps erased by some catastrophic event that wiped away their achievements, their knowledge, their very existence? There's a theory, one that has gained traction in recent years, that ancient cultures were not the first to rise and fall on this planet. Perhaps we have it all backward. What if there were civilizations long before those we now consider the first societies, so advanced that their survivors were mistaken for gods? What if, after a global cataclysm, the remnants of these lost cultures scattered across the world, bringing with them their knowledge, their technologies, and their skills? What if the ancient gods, those mysterious beings that left their mark on cultures around the world, were not gods at all, but survivors of an earlier civilization that had once dominated the earth? The idea is not to indulge in fantasy, but rather to entertain the possibility that what we call history is not as linear as we've been taught. Imagine, for a moment, a world where a global catastrophe forced the survivors of a much older, more advanced society to scatter to the corners of the earth. These survivors, who carried the knowledge of their fallen world, might have seemed like gods to the people they encountered, beings who could perform miracles with technologies so advanced that they appeared to be nothing short of supernatural. What's more, these survivors may have attempted to rebuild what they could, using the remnants of their knowledge to spark new civilizations, their technologies, their teachings, and their symbols spread across the globe, not as divinely inspired gifts, but as the last echoes of a lost world. The monuments they left behind, the pyramids, the megaliths, the sacred sites, could be nothing more than the foundations of their once great civilization, markers of a time that we have forgotten, or worse, have never known. This notion, though speculative, invites us to look at ancient ruins not just as relics of past cultures, but as evidence of something far older and more mysterious. The very existence of these structures, often defying explanation, points to a story that is far from complete. They are pieces of a puzzle, waiting for the right eyes to recognize the pattern. What we are left with are whispers, faint echoes of a world that might have existed long before the rise of the civilizations we know, each stone and each ruin a silent witness to a past we have only begun to comprehend. It's a concept that challenges the mainstream timeline of human history, a timeline that places ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley as the earliest known cradles of human culture. But what if those cultures were merely the remnants of something that came before them? What if the true origins of human civilization stretch back further, to a time when ancient knowledge and advanced technologies were commonplace? As we continue to explore these questions, we're forced to reckon with the possibility that the true story of humanity is much older and far more complex than we've ever imagined. In the next section, we will look at the catastrophic events that could have erased these early civilizations from the historical record. If such advanced societies existed, what could have brought them to an end, And why have their legacies remained hidden beneath the sands of time? Could these global cataclysms be the key to understanding the origins of human civilization and the gods who might have once walked among us? The answers lie ahead in the lost histories of our distant past. All around the world, from the shores of ancient Mesopotamia to the mountains of South America, there are stories passed down through generations of cataclysms that reshaped the earth. Floods, fires, darkness descending from the sky, wars among the stars. These stories are the common thread that ties together the mythologies of distant cultures, civilizations that were separated by oceans and vast stretches of time. How could this be? How could so many cultures, so far apart, describe such similar, world-altering events? The flood is perhaps the most universal of these stories. From the biblical account of Noah to the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, the tale of a great deluge, a flood sent to wipe out humanity, is a motif that echoes throughout history. But these tales are not isolated to the West. They appear in cultures across the globe. The Hindu legend of Manu, who survives a great flood and repopulates the earth, the Chinese tale of Yu the Great and his battle to control the waters, the Native American legends of a great flood that swept away ancient peoples. All of these stories describe a singular earth-shattering event. But what if these stories aren't just myths? What if they are the echoes of a civilization-ending event, one that may have actually occurred in the distant past? Could these floods, these global catastrophes, be memories of a time when the earth itself was torn apart, when entire cultures, once thriving and advanced, were wiped from existence in a single catastrophic moment? The idea of a civilization reset, a cataclysmic event that resets human progress, erasing entire cultures from history, is not as far-fetched as it might first seem. These myths, while steeped in symbolism, might not be purely allegorical after all. They might reflect real events, remembered by survivors who were forced to rebuild from the ruins of their world. These survivors would not have known how to describe what they had witnessed. To them, the events they experienced, the sky turning dark, great floods washing away cities, fires that consumed everything in their path, would have seemed like the wrath of the gods themselves. They would have been left in a world that no longer resembled the one they had once known, their memories filtered through fear, awe, and the language of myth. Take the ancient Sumerians, for example. Their myth of the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the sky to teach humanity, could, in fact, reflect a historical reality, the survivors of a lost civilization. These survivors, having witnessed a global cataclysm, would have become the foundation of the gods in later myths. Their knowledge, their technology, and their skills, lost in the chaos of destruction, would have seemed like miracles to the people who encountered them. Over time, the survivors were mythologized, their human traits elevated to divine status. They became the gods of the ancient world. Similarly, in Greek mythology, we hear of the Titans, great beings who ruled before the gods, only to be overthrown in a mighty war. Could this war have been a real conflict between survivors of a once great civilization, with the so-called gods being the remnants of that society? The Titans could be nothing more than people extraordinary, perhaps, but still human, who were caught in the tide of a global collapse. And what about the stories of sky, wars, of battles fought in the heavens, where gods hurled thunderbolts and smote entire cities? These too may be symbolic representations of something much more grounded. Could the sky wars have been the result of technological clashes between these survivors, wielding advanced weapons in a world where civilization had been reduced to rubble? These stories, passed down as divine battles, could very well have been the only way the survivors of such an event could understand and recount the horrors they experienced. The stories of fire, too, carry this weight of cataclysmic memory, from the destruction of Pompeii to the myth of the Greek god Hephaestus, whose forge was said to be the source of all fire. We see the motif of fire as both creator and destroyer. In many cultures, fire is a symbol of both destruction and rebirth, and it's not hard to imagine how a massive world-altering event, such as the eruption of a supervolcano or the impact of an asteroid, could have caused widespread fires that wiped out entire populations. To those who survived such an event, fire would have symbolized both the destruction of the old world and the hope of a new beginning. And then there is the darkness. In cultures all around the world, there are stories of a time when the sun was obscured, when the earth was plunged into darkness. Whether it was an eclipse, volcanic ash, or a cosmic event, these stories speak to a shared memory of a time when the world went dark and survival became a struggle against the very forces of nature. Could this darkness be a memory of an event so devastating that it blotted out the sun itself? An event that brought humanity to the brink of extinction? These stories, while sometimes fantastical, share an emotional core. They speak of a time when the world was different, when human civilization was not yet established in the way we know it. They speak of a time when people struggled to understand the forces at play, when the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel before their eyes. These events were so profound, so world-altering, that they left deep, emotional scars on the survivors. Their attempts to understand what had happened, to explain the unexplainable, resulted in the creation of myths, stories that would endure for millennia. But these myths are not just the product of human imagination. They are the memories of those who lived through a world-changing event, filtered through the lens of culture, language, and time. They are not mere fantasy. They are the remnants of a civilization that may have existed long before ours, one that was lost to time, swallowed up by the very forces that shaped our planet. The survivors of this civilization did not vanish. They scattered, bringing their knowledge and their stories with them. These stories became the foundation of myth, stories of gods, of beings who came from the sky, of great wars, floods, and fires that shaped the earth. In the next chapter, we will explore who these survivors might have been. What was their civilization like? Why did they disappear? And how did they become immortalized in the stories of the gods? The mysteries deepen, and the search for answers leads us to the very foundations of human history itself. The survivors may not have been divine, but their impact on the world they left behind has echoed across the ages, shaping the myths that still guide us today. Imagine, for a moment, a world on the brink of destruction. Civilization as we know it is unraveling, cities and empires crumbling under the weight of some catastrophic event, a cataclysm that reshapes the very face of the earth. In the midst of this chaos, there are those who survive, small pockets of people, scattered across the globe, clinging to life with the knowledge they carry, knowledge from a time when the world was very different, and technology was far beyond what these survivors could ever have imagined. These survivors, thrust into a world of primitive tribes and cultures, would have appeared as something entirely otherworldly. They would have been seen not as mere humans, but as beings from the heavens, their knowledge of agriculture, engineering, astronomy, and even medicine beyond anything these new civilizations could comprehend. A single individual carrying the tools of their lost world, tools far too advanced for the time, could easily be seen as a god. Their ability to perform tasks that seemed miraculous, from healing the sick to building structures of stone and earth, would have been nothing short of magical to those who had no frame of reference. The key to understanding how these survivors were transformed into gods lies in the psychology of memory. Over time, the memories of these events would have been distorted, twisted, and mythologized. The people who had once led, who had shared their knowledge and survival skills, would become figures of legend. Their advanced tools might have been remembered as magic, their warnings as prophecies, and their leadership as divine rulership. These survivors would have been revered and worshipped, not as ordinary people, but as gods sent to guide humanity through a period of great loss and rebuilding. Consider the example of the ancient gods and heroes who emerged from myth. Figures like Prometheus, who brought fire to humanity, or Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom and knowledge. They didn't just appear from the ether. They were likely the survivors of a lost world, their knowledge of fire, agriculture, writing, and healing passed down to the next generation as sacred gifts. What might have seemed like divine gifts from the heavens were, in reality, the surviving remnants of an advanced civilization's knowledge, now passed into myth. The process of myth making is a powerful one, especially in the wake of catastrophe. When societies experience trauma, whether from a natural disaster, a societal collapse, or the sudden disappearance of their leaders, the human mind seeks to make sense of the chaos. In these dark moments, the human need for explanation often leads to the creation of stories that provide structure, meaning, and hope in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. And over time, these stories become ingrained in the culture, passed down from generation to generation, until they evolve into something far greater than the truth they once contained. These stories of gods descending from the sky, of great heroes who rose up to lead their people, are not just the products of imagination. They are the memories of a time long past, memories of a world that was lost in the wake of a global catastrophe. What if we've misunderstood these stories entirely? What if the gods were not divine beings, but survivors, passing on the remnants of a once great civilization to those who would follow? The key to understanding this transformation lies in the power of storytelling. Once a survivor was elevated to the status of a god, their true nature, whether human, near human, or something else entirely, was obscured by time and myth. Their real stories became legends, their actions exaggerated, their abilities magnified. The truth was no longer important, it was the meaning of the story that mattered. And so, over time, what began as a simple tale of survival became the foundation of a religion, a divine narrative passed down through the ages. Now, consider this. What if, in the future, humanity faces a catastrophe, one that wipes out most of the world as we know it? What if, in the aftermath, a new civilization emerges, struggling to rebuild? And what if future humans looking back at us were to interpret our knowledge, our technology, and our accomplishments through the lens of myth? How would they view us? Would they see our advancements in communication, our understanding of medicine, or our ability to manipulate the environment as the work of gods? Or would they, too, transform our actions into the stuff of legend, remembering us not as ordinary humans, but as powerful beings who once ruled the earth? This is the chilling question that we must grapple with as we consider the origins of the gods of the past. The survivors of a lost civilization were, in their time, nothing more than people. But as their memories were passed down, they became something far more, something eternal, something mythic. What if, in the distant future, the same thing happens to us? What if our own knowledge, our technology, our very existence is mythologized by those who come after us? Would we be remembered as gods, or as mere mortals, who once walked the earth, just as these ancient beings did before us? With this thought in mind, we begin to turn our attention to specific examples of ancient gods, who display the characteristics of real-world survivors, figures who might have once been human, but were later elevated to the status of divine beings through the power of myth. From the Anunnaki of Sumer to the gods of Egypt and Greece, the stories of these gods are rich with clues that suggest they were far more than the supernatural figures we have come to believe in. These stories are not just legends, they are the echoes of a time long lost, the memories of those who survived, and the beginnings of the myths we still hold dear today. As we explore these figures in the next section, we'll begin to peel back the layers of myth and examine the possibility that the gods, far from being divine, were simply the last witnesses of a world destroyed. In nearly every ancient civilization, there are figures who stand out, not as divine beings, but as extraordinary teachers. These are the figures who arrive suddenly, bearing knowledge that seems far beyond the capabilities of the societies they encounter. They teach not miracles, but practical skills: agriculture, astronomy, medicine, navigation, essential knowledge that allows humanity to thrive and rebuild. Their stories are not ones of omnipotence, but of wisdom, leadership, and vulnerability. These figures lack the boundless power typically associated with gods. Instead, they seem like real people, albeit people who carry with them the knowledge of a forgotten world. Prometheus, the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, is a perfect example. He didn't bestow magical powers on humanity, but instead he brought fire, an essential tool that would forever change the course of human development. Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom and writing, did not create the heavens, but he taught humanity how to write and preserve knowledge. Viracocha, the creator god of the Andes, is said to have brought knowledge of agriculture and civilization to the people of ancient Peru. And Enki, the Sumerian god associated with water, wisdom, and creation, is depicted not as an all-powerful deity, but as a figure who shared knowledge of irrigation and agriculture, key to the survival of early Mesopotamian societies. In each case, these gods are more like mentors, guiding their people through a difficult transition. Their stories are strikingly similar. They arrive during a time of darkness when civilization has been lost or destroyed. They bring with them knowledge that allows society to recover and rebuild. And then, often mysteriously, they depart, leaving behind only their teachings and the faintest traces of their existence. But what sets these figures apart from the typical godlike figure is their very human characteristics. Unlike the omnipotent gods of later religions, these beings are shown to have limitations. They experience suffering, vulnerability, and, in some cases, death. Prometheus is punished for his gift of fire, bound to a rock where an eagle eats his liver each day. Thoth, while revered as the god of wisdom, is not a creator god in the traditional sense. He is a teacher, viracocha, and enki, though both credited with great acts of creation and teaching, seem to operate within the bounds of human experience. They are wise, but not invincible. This is where the line between divine and human begins to blur. The more we look at these figures, the more they seem less like gods and more like survivors. People who, having lived through a cataclysmic event, carried the knowledge of a lost civilization with them. They were not divine beings with unchallenged power, but leaders who emerged in a time of need, offering wisdom and guidance to people struggling to rebuild. These gods didn't come to perform impossible feats or to manipulate the world around them. They didn't command the weather, change the course of rivers, or transform into animals. Instead, they taught practical skills that allowed humanity to rebuild after a disaster. Why is it that the gods teach agriculture, mathematics, and architecture, but never cosmic miracles? Perhaps because the world they came from was not magical at all. It was real, grounded in the practicalities of survival and rebuilding. The skills they passed on were essential for a world recovering from destruction. These stories read more like historical biographies than divine myths. They feel like the accounts of real people who did remarkable things, not because they were gods, but because they were survivors. The knowledge they imparted wasn't supernatural, it was practical and transformative. In a way, they were culture bringers, much like the first humans who ventured into new lands and shared their tools and techniques with others. But instead of being remembered as explorers or conquerors, they became gods. Their identities slowly transformed and elevated by the people they helped. As we look across cultures, the similarities are striking. In Sumer, the god Enki is credited with bringing the knowledge of irrigation and agriculture to humanity. In Egypt, Thoth is the god of wisdom, the one who brought writing and knowledge to the ancient Egyptians. In the Andes, Viracocha is the god who emerged from the sea to teach the people how to grow crops and create the foundations of civilization. Each of these figures appears at a time of great crisis, whether it's a flood, a war, or a societal collapse, and brings with them the knowledge necessary for survival. These gods were not immortal beings who appeared from the heavens, but rather survivors of a lost civilization, beings who had witnessed the collapse of their world and now sought to pass on their knowledge to the next generation. Their arrival was not a divine act, but a necessary one, a gift from those who had once known a more advanced world. The wisdom they shared was not divinely inspired, but rather the practical knowledge they had preserved through the collapse of their civilization. So, why were these survivors transformed into gods? The answer lies in the power of myth. As these figures passed into legend, their very human traits were exaggerated. Their vulnerabilities, whether it was Prometheus's punishment or Thoth's role as a humble teacher, were transformed into divine struggles. The stories that were once grounded in reality became elevated to a supernatural level as the memory of their real-world experiences faded into the mists of time. This process of deification is not unique to these figures, it is a pattern seen across cultures. A wise figure, a leader, or a teacher is remembered not for their human qualities, but for their extraordinary abilities. Over time, the stories become less about what they did and more about what they became. A god. The line between human and divine becomes blurred, and the figure who once taught humanity how to survive becomes immortalized as something more than human. In the next section, we will examine how the knowledge these gods possessed was not just wisdom, but advanced science, knowledge that in some cases seems far ahead of its time. The tools they passed on, the systems they created, and the way they understood the world might provide the final piece of the puzzle. Were they really just survivors? Or were they something more carrying with them, the knowledge of a civilization long forgotten? The next chapter will explore the advanced knowledge these survivors might have carried, and how that knowledge has shaped the world we know today. In the quiet shadows of ancient civilizations, there are glimpses of knowledge that seem far too advanced for the time in which they were supposedly developed. How did the ancient Egyptians, for example, build structures with such precise mathematical and astronomical alignments that even modern engineers struggle to replicate them? How did the Sumerians, whose society predates recorded history by millennia, develop complex systems of writing, mathematics, and geometry? What was it that allowed these early societies to create incredibly advanced technologies that, by all accounts, should have taken thousands of years to evolve? The question arises naturally, where did this knowledge come from? It's not just about the tools or techniques, it's about the very precision and complexity that seems to have appeared suddenly fully formed in these ancient cultures. The megalithic structures that still stand today, the Great Pyramids, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, are prime examples of this phenomenon. They are not just grand works of art or architecture, they are pieces of a puzzle, full of unanswered questions. Each stone, each alignment, each measurement is more precise than what one might expect from a society that had, by all accounts, only rudimentary tools at their disposal. Consider the construction of the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, with its astonishing alignment to the cardinal points of the compass and its near-perfect proportions, was built with tools so basic by today's standards that it's almost impossible to imagine how such precision was achieved. The same goes for Stonehenge in England, where massive stones were transported and placed with such accuracy that they align perfectly with the movements of the sun and moon. These structures weren't just built, they were designed with an understanding of geometry, astronomy, and the natural world that seems to have far outpaced the knowledge of the time. Yet, despite the mystery of how these structures were built, what is perhaps even more perplexing is the advanced knowledge behind them. These early civilizations didn't just stumble upon this knowledge, they seem to have inherited it. The knowledge of geometry, celestial navigation, metallurgy, and agriculture didn't evolve gradually. It appeared in full form, as if handed down from a source that had already mastered these arts. Mythologies from around the world often speak of gods descending from the heavens, bringing this knowledge with them. The Sumerians, for instance, spoke of the Anunnaki, who brought knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and metallurgy to humanity. The Egyptians credited the god Thoth with bringing wisdom and writing, while the Greeks looked to Prometheus, who gave fire and civilization to humanity. These gifts were not just the passing of knowledge, they were tools of survival, crucial to rebuilding after some unknown cataclysmic event. These stories, while often dismissed as myth, could actually be encoding the history of a lost civilization, one that was far more advanced than anything that followed. The gods who brought these skills weren't simply divine beings, they were survivors, carrying fragments of a lost world and attempting to pass that knowledge to a new generation. It's not that humanity invented these technologies slowly over time. Rather, it's as if humanity inherited them from an older culture that had already mastered them. But why were these teachings passed down through myth? The answer lies in how knowledge was preserved in the ancient world. Without written records or sophisticated tools, ancient people relied on storytelling and ritual to pass down important information. What began as practical advice, survival techniques, and tools became embedded in mythic language, transformed into sacred teachings and divine commandments. Over time, what had once been straightforward knowledge became mythologized, its origins lost to time. The gods who brought this knowledge became immortalized in stories, their human traits exaggerated, their actions elevated to the level of divine feats. This transformation of practical knowledge into divine lore is not just a feature of ancient myths. It's how societies preserved their history, their wisdom, and their survival techniques in a world where the written word was rare and unreliable. Consider how ancient calendars were used to track celestial events, allowing cultures like the Maya to predict eclipses and equinoxes with astonishing accuracy. These calendars weren't simply tools for timekeeping. They were based on an advanced understanding of the cycles of the Earth, the Moon, and the stars. The Sumerians, too, developed a sophisticated system of timekeeping, dividing the year into 12 months and creating the basis for our modern calendar. Yet, these systems were not the product of trial and error over generations. They were built upon knowledge that appeared suddenly, fully formed, as if passed down from a time when humanity had a deeper understanding of the cosmos. This knowledge, passed down through the ages, would eventually become sacred. The very skills that were once necessary for survival, skills in agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and healing, became the domain of priests, kings, and shamans. The gods who taught these skills were no longer viewed as mere survivors, but as divine beings who held the keys to the universe. And so, their knowledge, which had once been practical and grounded in reality, was transformed into ritual, into law, into doctrine. What began as a way to understand the stars became a way to control the world beneath them. What began as practical survival tools became divinely inspired commandments, shaping the very structure of ancient societies. But the real question we must ask is, why did this knowledge seem to appear so suddenly, fully formed, And why did it come in the form of gifts from the gods? The answer may lie in the possibility that these early civilizations were not the first on Earth, but rather the survivors of a previous, more advanced culture, a culture that was lost in some cataclysmic event. The survivors, carrying with them the knowledge of a world that had fallen, passed on their wisdom in the only way they could, through myth, ritual, and divine legend. As we look at the remnants of ancient knowledge, whether it's the advanced mathematics behind the pyramids, the celestial alignments of Stonehenge, or the precise calendars of the Maya, we are forced to ask ourselves, where did it all come from? How did these civilizations begin with knowledge that, by all accounts, should have taken thousands of years to develop? And why did they attribute this knowledge to the gods? The answer to these questions is not simple. It may lie in the forgotten history of an ancient civilization, one that came before recorded history and whose survivors carried with them the knowledge of a world that no longer exists. This lost knowledge, passed down through generations, became the foundation of the myths and legends that continue to shape our understanding of the ancient world. In the next section, we will examine whether these ancient monuments, with their astonishing precision and advanced knowledge, act as messages from those very survivors, messages that, though obscured by time and myth, might still hold the key to understanding our true origins. The puzzle pieces are slowly coming together, and the answer may be hidden in the very structures that have baffled historians for centuries. Amid the sprawling deserts of Egypt, the lush plains of Turkey, and the high altitudes of the Andes, there are structures that have stood the test of time, monuments whose precision and complexity continue to defy the explanation we've been given. The Great Pyramid of Giza, Göbekli Tepe, Tiwanaku, Stonehenge. These iconic sites are not just impressive feats of engineering, they are monumental puzzles, their very existence suggesting that the cultures that built them may have been capable of far more than we are led to believe. These monuments are not divine miracles created by gods, but rather the handiwork of a civilization that possessed knowledge far beyond the conventional understanding of ancient history. Their design, their purpose, and their alignment to the stars and celestial bodies hint at a deep awareness of cosmic cycles, an understanding of the universe that suggests a lost culture that had mastered the forces of nature long before recorded history. It's not just the awe-inspiring size of these structures that commands attention, it's their purpose. Were they built to serve as time capsules, their precise alignments encoded with knowledge meant to survive cataclysms, a gift for future generations who may one day find them again? Imagine, for a moment, a world teetering on the edge of destruction. A once great civilization, teeming with knowledge and technological marvels, is brought to its knees by some world-shaking event, a natural disaster, a cosmic event, or perhaps something more. As the survivors struggle to rebuild in a shattered world, they know that the knowledge they hold must survive, that the lessons learned from the past must be passed on, not just to their own descendants, but to those who might one day come across their remnants. What better way to ensure that the wisdom of their civilization survives than by creating monuments that will endure for millennia? The Great Pyramid of Giza, with its near-perfect alignment to the cardinal points of the Earth, serves as a prime example. Built with such precision that it continues to captivate modern engineers and archaeologists, the pyramid was not just a tomb for pharaohs, it was a structure that encoded the knowledge of the stars, of geometry, and of the universe. The mathematical principles behind the pyramid's construction, along with its alignment to the stars, suggest a deep understanding of celestial mechanics. Was this knowledge a gift from the gods, as the ancient Egyptians believed, or was it the knowledge of survivors from a lost civilization, passed down to guide future generations? Similarly, the site of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey presents another profound mystery. Predating Stonehenge by thousands of years, this ancient structure consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circular formations, many of which are adorned with intricate carvings of animals and symbols. The precision with which these stones were placed, and the sheer effort involved in their construction, suggests that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were not merely hunter-gatherers as some have speculated. Instead, they were capable of feats of engineering and symbolic complexity that rival those of much later cultures. Some researchers believe that the alignment of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe corresponds to celestial events, such as the rising and setting of certain stars? What if, like the pyramids of Egypt, this site was designed as a message, a time capsule left behind by a forgotten civilization, containing clues for future generations to decipher? In South America, the ruins of Tiwanaku stand as another testament to the advanced capabilities of ancient cultures. The massive stone blocks that make up the structure, some weighing several tons, are so precisely cut and arranged that they fit together with extraordinary precision. The site is located high in the Andes, and the stone's alignment to the sun, the stars, and the solstices suggests a deep understanding of astronomy and the natural world. These monumental structures were not merely decorative. They were designed to withstand the ravages of time and to communicate knowledge across generations, perhaps to warn future civilizations of the fragility of their world. And then there is the mystery of Stonehenge. The massive stones that form this ancient circle were transported from great distances, some weighing as much as 25 tons, and arranged with remarkable precision. For the alignment of the stones with the summer solstice, as well as their relation to the movements of the sun and moon, suggests an advanced knowledge of astronomy and celestial cycles. But why were these massive stones erected in the first place? Was Stonehenge merely a religious site, or could it have been built as a message, an enduring marker for future generations, guiding them with the knowledge of their ancestors? These monuments, with their precise engineering, astronomical alignments, and symbolic complexity, cannot be dismissed as the work of primitive societies. The idea that such advanced knowledge could have existed in the far distant past challenges the conventional timelines of human history. These monuments were not just built for ceremonial purposes, they were designed to endure, to survive the passage of time, and perhaps to communicate with those who would one day discover them. In a sense, these monuments act as memory anchors, physical markers left behind by survivors of a lost civilization, encoded with knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to history. The knowledge contained within these structures may have been intended as a safeguard, a way for the survivors to preserve the wisdom of the past and pass it on to future generations. But the wisdom encoded in these stones is not just about survival. It is about understanding the cosmos, about mastering the forces of nature, and about leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after their civilization had collapsed. These structures, made of stone and designed to withstand the ravages of time, stand as silent witnesses to a lost world. They are more than just buildings, they are messages, time capsules created by those who had seen their world destroyed and understood that their knowledge must endure. Through their alignment to the stars and their symbolic complexity, these monuments encode a story of survival, of wisdom, and of a civilization that once spanned the earth. Their very existence asks the question, what if the knowledge we now take for granted was not the product of gradual discovery, but the gift of survivors, beings who had once lived in a world far more advanced than ours? These questions lead us naturally into the next section, where we will explore how ancient myths, too, serve as vessels for this lost knowledge. If monuments like the Great Pyramid or Göbekli Tepe were designed to preserve knowledge for the future, perhaps ancient myths were likewise crafted to encode the wisdom of the survivors of a lost civilization. Just as stone survives where paper perishes, so too did the myths and stories of these ancient survivors endure, carrying with them fragments of truth that continue to shape our understanding of the past. In the next chapter, we will explore how these myths may preserve the very testimony of those who lived through a world-shattering catastrophe, offering us a glimpse into a time long forgotten. When we think of myths, we often imagine fantastical stories, gods descending from the heavens, epic battles between celestial forces, and the creation of the world itself. These tales are rich in symbolism and imagination, yet their origin may not be as fantastical as we've been led to believe. What if these ancient myths were not the product of pure imagination, but rather the distorted memories of events, so overwhelming, so world-altering, that early humanity could hardly comprehend them? It's a profound idea, one that asks us to reconsider what we call myth. What if these stories weren't just the creations of ancient storytellers, but were instead the attempts of survivors to make sense of a cataclysmic past, events that shattered their understanding of the world? What if the great flood myths, the stories of gods coming down from the sky, and the battles between celestial forces weren't just allegories or religious parables, but were memories of a civilization, ending event reshaped and passed down through generations. Myth, in this light, becomes more than a collection of fanciful tales. It becomes a record of collective trauma, fear, and awe, an attempt to make sense of a world that was forever changed. Think of the great flood myths found across cultures. In the Bible, Noah's Ark tells of a catastrophic flood sent to wipe out humanity. In Sumerian mythology, the story of Gilgamesh recounts a similar flood, sent by the gods to punish mankind. Native American tribes, the ancient Greeks, and cultures across the globe all have stories of a great flood, a deluge that wiped out the old world and forced the survivors to start anew. What if these flood myths were not merely allegorical, but actual memories distorted, of course, of a time when a great disaster reshaped the world? The flood might not have been a divine punishment, but rather the result of a catastrophic event, such as a massive flood triggered by rising sea levels, a comet impact, or a sudden climatic shift. The survivors of such an event would have experienced trauma so profound that their only way to process it was to encode it into a narrative, a myth, that could be passed down through the generations. Similarly, creation myths across cultures speak of the world emerging from chaos. The ancient Egyptians spoke of the waters of none, from which the world was created. In the Greek myth of chaos, the world emerged from the void. In both cases, creation sprang from destruction, an idea that might reflect the traumatic birth of a new world after a global catastrophe. These stories are not just poetic explanations of how the world began. They might represent humanity's attempt to understand and integrate the destruction and rebirth of their civilization. The myths are a way of explaining how the survivors of a world-shattering event could begin again, even after everything they knew had been destroyed. The gods in these stories often descend from the sky, bringing wisdom, knowledge, and technology to the survivors. The Sumerians Anunnaki, the Greeks Titans, the Egyptian Neteru, all are said to have descended from above, imparting divine knowledge to early humans. What if, instead of being gods in the traditional sense, these figures were survivors of a lost civilization, beings who carried knowledge from a time when humanity was more advanced? In this light, the gods' descent from the sky is not supernatural. It is symbolic of the survivors' arrival, bringing with them the tools to rebuild a shattered world. These survivors, armed with knowledge of agriculture, writing, architecture, and astronomy, were seen as divine because their knowledge was so far beyond what those around them had ever known. But here's the key. These stories didn't start as mythology. They were stories of real events, memories of a world that no longer existed. They were shaped by fear, by the awe of what had been lost, and by the desire to understand something so overwhelming that it was impossible to grasp fully. What we call myth is, in this sense, a form of cultural memory, distorted, yes, over generations, but still a record of something profound. As humanity passed down these stories, they became more than just warnings. They became lessons, encoded in the mythic language of gods, heroes, and cosmic battles. This reframing of myth as memory changes everything. We begin to see that mythologies are not just fanciful tales meant to explain the unknown. Instead, they may be attempts by humanity to remember and understand the most catastrophic events in our history. When the myths speak of gods descending from the sky, they may not be talking about divine figures at all, but about survivors of an ancient world who came to teach a new civilization how to rebuild. When myths speak of cosmic battles, they might be reflecting the real struggles that occurred as different groups of survivors clashed, or perhaps even as the remnants of a dying world fought for survival. The flood myths, creation stories, and sky battle legends we know today might be humanity's earliest attempt to record their most traumatic experiences, memories of the end of an ancient world. What if these stories, instead of being pure fantasy, are the encoded survival strategies of a civilization that survived the greatest catastrophe of all? Myths, in this context, become not just cultural artifacts, but the very foundation of our understanding of who we are and where we come from. Now, as you consider this, think about how these myths have been passed down, not just as stories but as lessons. Generations after the original survivors, these stories were told again and again, becoming rituals, sacred teachings, and the backbone of new religious practices. But what was once practical advice, how to rebuild, how to survive, how to thrive, eventually became mythologized, its original meaning buried under layers of symbolism and interpretation. In the next section, we'll explore how these ancient memories were preserved through rituals and oral traditions. How did entire cultures keep these memories alive? And how did the survivors' teachings transform into sacred stories and divine laws? We'll see how the survivors' knowledge, passed down through generations, evolved from simple survival wisdom to the mythic structures we know today. The very rituals that have come to define ancient religions may hold the key to understanding the deeper truths behind the myths. In the quiet shadows of ancient ceremonies, where smoke rises from sacred fires and the rhythmic beats of drums echo through the night, there exists a powerful truth hidden within the rituals. These ceremonies, performed by shamans, priests, and elders, were not just spiritual practices. They were vessels of ancestral memory, encoded with the wisdom and survival knowledge of those who lived through a world-altering catastrophe. These rituals are the echoes of a forgotten past, handed down through generations in the form of sacred stories, performances, and symbolic reenactments. Imagine for a moment a time when written language was scarce or even forbidden. In this world, the guardians of knowledge were not scribes or scholars, but the keepers of tradition, those entrusted with passing down the memories of the past. Shamans, priests, and elders became the custodians of wisdom, weaving together the myths and stories that preserved vital knowledge. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were encoded with the very survival strategies and warnings needed to navigate a fractured world. The survival of humanity depended on the ability to remember, to pass on the lessons of the past to those who would come after us. The ceremonies themselves were not just symbolic. They were the means through which knowledge was preserved and communicated. Fire rituals, for example, may have been a way to memorialize cosmic impacts, events that caused widespread destruction and changed the course of history. The flickering flames of the ritual could represent the fires of a cataclysmic event, when the heavens themselves seemed to fall to earth, burning everything in their path. These rituals could have been an attempt to capture the essence of that cosmic moment, preserving the memory of a time when the world was reshaped by fire, and the survivors were left to rebuild. Water rites, too, might symbolize the floods that ravaged the earth, deluges that swept away entire civilizations. The cleansing power of water, often seen as both a destructive and purifying force, could reflect memories of a great flood, when survivors were forced to rise above the waters and start anew. The sacred use of water in rituals may not have been about simple purification, but a deeper attempt to remember the event that nearly wiped out humanity. Water, in this context, was more than a symbol of life. It was a memory of death, of the destruction of a world that no longer existed, and the rebirth of a new one. Ascension ceremonies, which often depict gods or heroes rising from the earth or ascending to the heavens, may also have their roots in the memories of survivors who witnessed or participated in the last vestiges of an ancient, lost civilization. These ceremonies could be the symbolic reenactment of people who, against all odds, survived the collapse of their world and ascended to guide the future. The gods who descended to earth were not divine beings, but survivors, beings who carried with them the knowledge of a lost world and left behind the legacy of their survival. These ascension rituals might have been their way of preserving the memory of their extraordinary return to the heavens as leaders or teachers, offering guidance to a new generation. As time passed, the original meanings of these rituals likely faded. What began as practical reenactments of historical events became layered with symbolism and spiritual significance. The fire rituals, once meant to remember cosmic destruction, evolved into sacred ceremonies celebrating the elements. Water rites, born from the memory of great floods, became purification rituals. Ascension ceremonies, once representing the survival of an ancient civilization, became celebrations of divine transcendence. The rituals, though stripped of their original meaning, continued to serve a vital purpose. They kept the memory of the past alive, albeit in a form that was increasingly abstracted from the original events. It's important to remember how fragile human memory is. As generations passed, the direct connection to the original events was lost. What was once encoded in ritual, passed down with reverence and care, became increasingly subject to reinterpretation and embellishment. Yet, despite this, the core of these ceremonies, their symbolic representations of catastrophic events, remained a vital part of cultural identity. These ancient rituals acted as a bridge, connecting the survivors of a lost world to the generations that followed, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would not be completely forgotten. The stories encoded in these rituals were not just about remembering the past, they were also about teaching future generations how to survive. The rituals were a way to instill lessons in resilience, survival, and wisdom in the face of catastrophe. The very act of performing these ceremonies was a way of reaffirming the connection between past and present, of ensuring that the lessons learned in the aftermath of a disaster would not be lost. Now, as we look back at these ancient rituals, we are confronted with a tantalizing question. Could they be reenactments of events no historian remembers? Could the rituals we now see as religious or ceremonial have originally been meant to preserve knowledge, memories of a world that was lost, a civilization that was destroyed, and the survivors who carried with them the key to rebuilding? The idea that rituals are not just religious observances, but vessels of memory, opens up a whole new way of understanding the ancient world. These rituals, performed in temples, caves, and sacred spaces, were not just expressions of belief, they were survival tools, designed to preserve the teachings of the past and pass them down through the generations. They were the collective memory of humanity, shaped and transformed into symbolic acts that transcended time, allowing the survivors of a lost civilization to guide the future through stories, symbols, and rituals. As we explore the power of these ancient ceremonies, we begin to see them not just as religious or cultural artifacts, but as the living, breathing memory of humanity's darkest nights. These rites encoded the wisdom of survival, the lessons of a forgotten world, and the hopes of those who endured cataclysmic change. They are the key to unlocking the mysteries of the past, and through them, we can begin to piece together the story of a civilization that may have been lost, but whose memory still lingers in the rituals we perform, the myths we tell, and the symbols we revere. In the next chapter, we will shift focus to the very human question of survival, how the gods, who carried these teachings, lived and traveled across a collapsing world. How did they protect and maintain the knowledge they carried with them, and what became of their descendants? The story of the gods is not just a mythic tale, it is a survival story, one that may hold the key to understanding the ancient wisdom that shaped our world. In the aftermath of a world-shattering catastrophe, when the known world crumbles to dust, how do the survivors endure? The ancient world, as it was, disappears in a moment of unimaginable chaos, floods, fires, impacts, or perhaps wars that ravage civilizations. Yet, in the ruins, there are those who remain, small pockets of survivors, carrying the memory of a lost civilization and the knowledge needed to rebuild. These survivors are not just scattered people, they are the last remnants of a world that was once far more advanced, and they must find a way to survive in a new and hostile world. Imagine, if you will, a group of survivors fleeing from the wreckage of their once great city, their homes, their technology, their way of life, gone in an instant. What remains are the tools of survival, those who know how to build shelter, grow food, heal the sick, and navigate across a shattered world. They carry with them fragments of knowledge, maps, rudimentary scientific understanding, agricultural techniques, and healing practices, all remnants of a world they once knew, but one that no longer exists. As they traverse hostile landscapes, these survivors must rely on their wits and skills to survive. They are not only fighting for their lives, but also for the survival of the knowledge they carry. Navigation becomes crucial, surviving in a world where the old maps are no longer valid, and where nature itself has been transformed. Shelter, building becomes an art, as these survivors create havens that can protect them from the elements and provide some semblance of safety. Medicine and healing, once commonplace knowledge, now become rare and sacred skills, passed down carefully to the few who can keep the flame of life burning. These survivors, once just ordinary members of a now lost civilization, find themselves becoming something much more than human. As they encounter simpler societies, tribes that have no memory of cities, of technology, of the life that once thrived, these survivors appear almost superhuman by comparison. Their ability to heal with plants and herbs, to navigate using the stars, to craft tools and buildings with astonishing skill. These abilities elevate them to near mythical status. The survivors of the old world, with their knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and medicine, may be seen as gods or heroes, by those who have never known such wonders. But these survivors are not gods. They are simply people who have lived through something unimaginably devastating. Their experiences have changed them, and their knowledge, once common to the civilization they came from, has now become something sacred. They are not seen as divine because of their inherent power, but because they are the bearers of knowledge, the teachers who have the power to help rebuild a shattered world. Their healing practices are seen as miraculous. Their understanding of the stars is treated as wisdom from the heavens. In the eyes of those they meet, they are more than human. They are the living embodiment of the ancient world. The survivors, exhausted and traumatized by the collapse of their civilization, find themselves in a strange new role. They are not just survivors, they are the builders of the future, the creators of a new world. In many ways, they become the first gods in myth, not because they possess divine power, but because they bring with them the knowledge of a world that has been lost. They rebuild what they can, teaching the next generations how to survive and thrive in a world that is no longer the one they once knew. These survivors might not even recognize themselves as gods, but to those who encounter them, their knowledge and their resilience make them something more than human. Their trauma, their exhaustion, and their loss are woven into the fabric of the stories that will be told about them for generations. The survivors of the lost civilization, in their attempts to rebuild, may have found themselves elevated in the collective memory of those they taught. What was once practical knowledge becomes mythologized, and the people who saved their knowledge and preserved the seeds of humanity's future become immortalized as gods. Not because of supernatural feats, but because they brought the tools of survival when everything seemed lost. But the survival of these ancient beings was not easy. As they ventured across broken lands, they encountered not only environmental challenges, but also other groups of survivors, each with their own fragments of knowledge and survival techniques. These migrations, scattered across continents, could have been the catalyst for the diffusion of ideas, tools, and culture. These survivors, by necessity, would have had to navigate not only physical landscapes, but also the complex social terrain of a world that had been reshaped by disaster. In the next section, we will explore the global migrations that these survivors may have undertaken, tracing the path of their knowledge and wisdom as they traveled to distant lands, leaving behind traces of their once great civilization. These survivors, moving from one place to another, brought with them the seeds of civilization, seeds that would eventually grow into the stories and myths that we now recognize as the foundation of ancient cultures. The story of survival becomes the story of humanity's rebirth, as the knowledge of a lost world is carried across the earth, helping to shape the cultures that would follow. In the wake of global catastrophe, the survivors of a lost civilization would have found themselves scattered across vast stretches of land, pushed to the edges of what remained of their once great world. Their journey would not have been swift or easy, but a slow, somber trek across desolate deserts, over jagged mountains, and along winding coastlines. Struggling to preserve their knowledge, their memories, and their way of life, they would have moved in search of refuge, carrying with them the vestiges of a civilization that no longer existed. These survivors were not only fleeing a collapsed world, but also navigating the unknown, driven by the need to survive, rebuild, and pass on what little remained of their lost world. As they journeyed, these migrants would have encountered new peoples, unfamiliar landscapes, and untold challenges. Yet, despite these hardships, they managed to leave traces of their civilization behind. The symbols, tools, and myths that they carried with them, whether by design or by necessity, spread across continents, taking root in distant lands. These survivors, treated as gods by those they encountered, left footprints across the world, marks of their passage that would become the foundations of the earliest known cultures. The similarities between ancient cultures, despite the vast distances between them, suggest that these survivors might have seeded societies with their knowledge, technologies, and teachings. The survivors' paths could explain why ancient civilizations from South America to the Mediterranean shared such strikingly similar symbols, technologies, and myths. These survivors, journeying along coastlines and through inland territories, carried with them the knowledge of building, farming, astronomy, and engineering. As they moved along the coastlines, they may have influenced early societies along the shores of the Mediterranean, leaving behind traces of advanced architectural techniques, tools, and even the symbolic myths of gods who came from the sky. Similarly, As they ventured inland, they may have spread their stories to Africa, Asia, and Oceania, leaving behind the seeds of ancient civilizations that would later emerge. The shared symbols found in cultures across the world, such as the serpent, the eagle, or the winged sun, might be more than just coincidental. These symbols could have been the remnants of a once unified belief system passed down by survivors who wandered across continents. The serpent, for example, is often associated with knowledge, wisdom, and transformation, concepts that are central to the myths of many cultures. The eagle, a symbol of power and transcendence, appears in various mythologies, from the Greek gods to the Native American cultures. The winged sun is another motif that crosses cultures from Egypt to South America, suggesting a common thread of divine or celestial guidance. These symbols may have been the way survivors communicated their knowledge, creating a cultural language that transcended geographic boundaries. The tools and technologies that these survivors carried with them also spread across the world. As they passed through different regions, they would have taught the people they encountered how to build with stone, how to navigate by the stars, how to cultivate crops, and how to heal with plants. The monumental structures that arose in the wake of these migrations, pyramids, ziggurats, megalithic structures, could be seen not as isolated achievements, but as part of a broader global effort to rebuild after catastrophe. These structures were not just buildings, they were symbols of survival, each one a testament to the knowledge that had been passed down from the survivors of a lost civilization. As these survivors moved from place to place, their stories would have evolved, taking on new meanings in the different cultures they encountered. What began as simple teachings about survival, how to grow food, how to build shelter, how to navigate the world, would have transformed into myths and legends. The survivors, once ordinary people with extraordinary knowledge, would have been remembered as gods. Their actions, once practical and grounded in reality, would have been elevated to the realm of the divine. Over time, the stories of their travels would have been retold, reshaped by the cultures they encountered, until they became the gods and heroes of ancient myth. Imagine, then, the journey of a single group of survivors, moving from the Mediterranean to the Americas. Along the way, they would have encountered various tribes and cultures, each with its own understanding of the world. These survivors, carrying with them the knowledge of advanced astronomy, architecture, and agriculture, would have shared these gifts with the people they met. Over time, their teachings would have transformed into sacred wisdom, passed down through oral traditions and rituals. As these survivors made their way across the globe, they left behind not just physical remnants of their civilization, but cultural legacies that would endure for millennia. Did these gods walk across continents, leaving clues in every land they touched? The evidence suggests that they did. The striking similarities in mythologies, technologies, and symbols across cultures, despite the vast distances that separated them, cannot be easily explained by coincidence alone. These survivors, though scattered and fragmented, were part of a larger interconnected world. Their migration, though forced by catastrophe, became the vehicle for the spread of knowledge and wisdom, ensuring that the legacy of their lost civilization would live on in the cultures they helped shape. As we consider the paths these survivors may have taken, we must also think about the environments they entered. The world they once knew was gone, replaced by new landscapes and challenges. How did these survivors adapt to their new surroundings? How did they preserve the knowledge of a world lost to time? And what impact did they have on the cultures they encountered? In the next chapter, we will explore the environment that these survivors stepped into, examining how the Earth itself had been altered by the catastrophes they had witnessed. This shift from humanity to the environment will reveal just how much the world they encountered shaped the future of civilization, and how the survivors, though scattered, helped create the world we know today. After the fall, the world was a place of profound silence, a silence broken only by the wind, the roar of distant waves crashing against flooded coastlines, and the cries of displaced peoples struggling to survive. Imagine, for a moment, a planet that had once been teeming with life, now battered and broken by forces no one could fully comprehend. The skies, once bright with sunlight, now seem perpetually darkened, the sun obscured by clouds of ash or dust. Earthquakes, floods, fires, natural catastrophes reshaped the planet's face. Cities that had once been thriving hubs of civilization now lay in ruins, their ruins slowly being reclaimed by nature. For the survivors of this global catastrophe, everything had changed. Their world, their way of life, and the very landscape that once provided comfort and safety were now foreign and unrecognizable. It's easy to imagine the survivors of the old world wandering through this new landscape, confused, frightened, and in awe of the enormity of what had been lost. To them, the world they knew was a memory, a faint echo of a past now gone. And yet, there they stood, those who had witnessed the destruction, those who carried the knowledge of a world that no longer existed. To the survivors who had not witnessed the fall, these figures must have seemed nothing less than miraculous. These wanderers, carrying with them the wisdom of the past, the secrets of a lost civilization, would have been treated as gods. Their knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, engineering, and healing would have seemed otherworldly, and their stories of what had come before would have been viewed as divine revelations, shared by those who had survived the chaos. But the survivors, in reality, were no gods. They were people, flawed, exhausted, and deeply traumatized by what they had witnessed. They were not divine beings descended from the heavens, but simply those who remembered a world before the catastrophe. They carried with them the fragments of a civilization that had been erased, and it was through their knowledge, their teachings, and their guidance that humanity would begin to rebuild. As these survivors wandered through this shattered world, the landscape itself became an ever-present reminder of the world that was. The great cities now ruins, the fertile fields now barren, the once bustling rivers now dried up or flooded. Everything had changed. And yet, as the survivors moved forward, they would have sought to make sense of this new world, to understand what had happened, to explain the catastrophic events that had destroyed the world they once knew. In this struggle to understand, new myths began to take shape. The survivors' trauma and awe, mixed with the remnants of their memories, formed the foundations of the stories that would be passed down through generations. These new myths were not simply stories of gods and heroes. They were attempts to make sense of the unthinkable, stories of chaos, of a world torn asunder, of skies that rained fire or water, of lands that swallowed cities whole became. The new narratives, the ways in which humanity tried to explain a world that had gone terribly wrong. In many ways, these myths reflect humanity's deep need to find meaning in a world that seemed to have lost all sense of order. The gods in these myths, often wrathful or distant, are not the benevolent beings of later religions, but figures that embody the destructive forces that reshaped the earth. These gods were not creators, but survivors, beings who had witnessed the end of the world and now guided the remaining survivors through the new world they had been forced to inherit. Take, for example, the story of the Great Flood, which appears in nearly every ancient culture, whether it's the Sumerian tale of Gilgamesh, the biblical flood in the book of Genesis, or the flood myths found in cultures as far-flung as the Hopi in North America or the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. They all tell of a cataclysmic event, flooding that wipes out civilizations, a cosmic disaster that erases the old world. These stories, though told through the lens of myth, may actually be humanity's attempt to process the trauma of such a disaster, to make sense of a world that was irreversibly altered. In these myths, the flood is not merely a divine punishment or a natural disaster. It is the moment of reset, the point where humanity must begin again. The gods, those who survived the catastrophe, guide the survivors, teaching them how to rebuild, how to survive in this new world. But these gods are not omnipotent. They are simply those who remember. They know how to plant crops, how to navigate the stars, how to build shelter. Their teachings are not supernatural but practical, grounded in the knowledge of a lost world. And yet, as time passes and these myths are retold, the knowledge they contain is buried beneath layers of symbolism. What was once a story of survival becomes a story of divine intervention. The survivors, whose very human qualities were once evident, are transformed into gods, figures of awe and reverence, whose true origins are lost to time. As the survivors spread across the earth, the new myths take on different forms. In some cultures, the gods are seen as distant, transcendent beings whose wisdom is all-encompassing. In others, they are portrayed as rulers or warriors, leading the people to victory over chaos and disorder. But no matter the form these gods take, the essence of the myths remains the same. They are the stories of those who survived the fall and sought to preserve the knowledge of a lost civilization. Their teachings were not about the creation of the world, but about the survival of humanity in the aftermath of its destruction. So, as you wander through these ancient stories, ask yourself this: what kind of myth would you create if you inherited a world that looked nothing like the one your ancestors described? How would you explain the loss, the trauma, the disorientation? How would you frame the knowledge you carried, the knowledge of a civilization lost to time, in a way that would ensure its survival for generations to come? The myths that arose from the survivors' struggles to make sense of their world are the keys to understanding not only the past, but also our own present. These stories, shaped by trauma, fear, and the desperate need to survive, are the foundations of the cultures that would rise from the ashes of the old world. In the next section, we will explore how societies guided by these myths began the long and difficult process of rebuilding under the leadership of those who remembered the world before the fall. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, would serve as the cornerstone of civilization's rebirth. After the Great Collapse, the world began to breathe again, though it was a different world, a world of beginnings rather than endings. Survivors scattered across the planet, like seeds carried by the wind, slowly began to gather and form the first seeds of civilization. They were not starting from scratch. They carried with them the knowledge of how to survive, how to build, and how to live. The survivors, those few who had witnessed the fall of a great world, became the guiding forces in this new, fractured landscape. And as small groups of people began to settle and reorganize, they did so around the wisdom of those who had remembered the old world. These survivors weren't gods in the traditional sense, but in the eyes of those who followed them, they might as well have been. They brought with them the foundations of farming, architecture, and governance, crucial knowledge that would allow these early societies to rebuild. Settlements began to form near sources of water, rivers, lakes, and fertile plains, places where crops could grow and life could be sustained. These areas, which had once been home to thriving civilizations, became the heart of new human settlements. The survivors, often led by individuals or small groups who had carried the collective wisdom of the old world, set about creating the first new cities. These were not mere villages, they were structured communities, built with purpose and foresight. The survivors knew that for humanity to thrive, they would need organization, leadership, and, most importantly, a plan for the future. The survivors' knowledge of agriculture was perhaps the most vital tool they carried. They knew how to cultivate the land, how to grow crops that would feed large populations, and how to manage the seasons. They knew how to create irrigation systems, how to harness the power of the soil, and how to ensure that life could continue even in the aftermath of a cataclysm. This knowledge was not handed down as divine insight, but as practical wisdom from those who had survived the collapse. They understood that without the ability to feed themselves, humanity could not rebuild. And so, they became the teachers of the first farmers, guiding them to create sustainable communities that could withstand the challenges of a new world. But rebuilding civilization was not only about farming, it was about rethinking how society could be structured. Early settlements, under the guidance of these survivors, began to adopt systems of governance. What had once been a chaotic, fragmented world was now in need of order. And so, the survivors, armed with the memory of the old world's governance structures, began to create new systems of leadership. These leaders, often revered as sages or demigods, instituted the first laws, the first forms of justice, and the first codes of conduct that would guide these fledgling societies. The survivors' knowledge extended beyond agriculture and governance. However, they had witnessed the movement of the stars, the patterns of the seasons, and the cycles of the earth. This ancient knowledge became the foundation for the study of astronomy. As new societies began to rebuild, the survivors, often seen as wise teachers, passed down their understanding of the heavens. They built the first observatories, studied the movements of celestial bodies, and used their knowledge to guide the agricultural calendar. They knew that the cycles of the stars were as important as the cycles of the seasons. By understanding the heavens, they could predict the future and bring order to the chaos of the world they had inherited. It was also in these early settlements that the great monuments of the ancient world began to take shape: ziggurats, pyramids, and sacred temples. Monuments to human resilience and ingenuity rose from the ground, not as symbols of worship, but as attempts to recreate the wonders of the old world. These structures, though simpler than the grand buildings of the past, were built with the same purpose in mind: to honor the memory of what had been lost and to provide a foundation for the future. The survivors, remembering the architectural marvels of their civilization, sought to recreate them in a world that had forgotten their original meaning. These structures became the centers of society, the places where knowledge was preserved, where leaders were crowned, and where the wisdom of the old world was passed down to the new generations. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, and temples in Mesoamerica. These monumental structures may not have been built by gods, but by survivors who had once known a civilization far more advanced than anything the New World could imagine. The building techniques, the precision, and the symbolic alignment of these structures point to a deep understanding of engineering and geometry, knowledge that had been passed down from a world now lost. These survivors were not building temples to gods, but monuments to the enduring spirit of humanity, an attempt to preserve the knowledge of a time before the fall. The story of the survivors is not one of divine intervention, but of human resilience and ingenuity. These individuals, though traumatized by the collapse of their world, became the architects of a new one. They were not gods, but they were the bridge between the past and the future. The knowledge they carried, passed down through memory, through rituals, and through the rebuilding of civilization, became the foundation upon which all future societies would stand. So, were humanity's earliest cities built under the guidance of people who remembered a forgotten age? The evidence suggests they were. The survivors of the ancient world, scattered across the globe, carried with them the knowledge of how to rebuild, how to survive, and how to thrive. In the wake of a global catastrophe, they became the teachers, the leaders, and the architects of a new civilization. Their wisdom, far from being divine, was simply the knowledge of those who had lived through a great catastrophe and sought to preserve it for the future. As we look at the ruins of ancient cities, the great temples, the pyramids, and the ziggurats, we are reminded not just of the gods that mythology says built them, but of the survivors who lived through a time of destruction and managed to rebuild. The survivors, though no longer gods in the traditional sense, left behind a legacy that would shape the future of humanity. The knowledge they preserved, the cities they built, and the teachings they passed down became the foundation of civilizations to come. In the next chapter, we will explore how these survivors, these first teachers and leaders, were mythologized over time. How did their human traits become divine qualities in the stories told about them? How did they transform from leaders of a fractured world into gods? And what does this tell us about the nature of myth and memory? The journey from survivor to God is not a simple one, but it is one that speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. As the survivors of the great catastrophe began to rebuild their lives, their presence and their knowledge would have naturally transformed from simple memory into legend. What began as the stories of those who had endured the end of an ancient world gradually became something much more, something eternal. The shift from human to divine, from mortal survivor to immortal God, didn't happen in an instant. It was a slow, gradual process, built on the foundations of awe, reverence, and necessity. In the early days, the survivors were not gods. They were simply people, those who remembered the world before the collapse, and carried with them the wisdom of how to rebuild. But as time passed and generations began to forget the specifics of the old world, these survivors began to take on greater significance in the eyes of their descendants. The knowledge they passed down, practical, life-saving knowledge, became something far more sacred, and the survivors who had once been teachers transformed into divine figures. This transformation wasn't based on their actual deeds, but on the need for something greater. After a world had been destroyed, people needed something to believe in, something to guide them through the uncertainty and fear that followed. The survivors, armed with knowledge that seemed miraculous in the context of a world that had lost so much, became the symbols of hope, strength, and divine intervention. As their stories were retold, what was once simple survival became mythologized. The survivors' actions teaching agriculture, architecture, healing, became the stuff of cosmic drama, their knowledge no longer mere instruction, but divine wisdom imparted to humanity. Over generations, the stories grew, and with them, so did the survivors' mythic status. What began as a biography of practical survival became a tale of cosmic scale. A healer who had taught the art of medicine became a god of health. A leader who had shown the way to rebuild became a god of order. Their teachings, once fragmented and specific, transformed into commandments and laws that governed societies for centuries. The once simple warnings, "Don't plant in the floodplain," or "Respect the stars," became prophecies delivered by divine figures sent to guide humanity through times of crisis. The process of deification is a psychological one. It begins with awe, the awe that one feels when they are face to face with something that seems beyond comprehension. For the survivors, their knowledge and survival in the face of catastrophe would have been awe-inspiring. But all cannot sustain the transformation from human to God. Fear also plays a role. In the wake of destruction, people are often desperate for explanations, for understanding, for something to cling to. The survivors' knowledge wasn't just a gift, it was a lifeline. It became intertwined with the psychological need for leadership in a world that no longer made sense. And in the absence of other explanations, these leaders were gradually elevated to a divine status, seen as the bridge between the broken past and the uncertain future. As the generations passed, the survivors' true identities faded. The longer the distance between the event and its telling, the more fragmented the memories became. Their true lives, who they were, where they came from, what they had actually done, became less important than the myths that were built around them. What mattered was the role they played in the story, their ability to bring humanity out of chaos and back into order. The survivors, in their original form, became distant, fading figures whose true humanity was erased by the weight of myth. What remained was their archetype, the wise, the powerful, the immortal teacher who could guide humanity through the darkness. This process is not unique to ancient history. It is part of how we understand our world and make sense of it. When faced with the unimaginable, we turn to myth to explain our suffering, our survival, and our need for leadership. And over time, we transform those who guide us into figures who are more than human, into gods. In ancient times, this process was particularly strong because the need for divine leadership was essential. Humanity had to believe that the wisdom of the past could guide them through the present. As societies rebuilt, the leaders of the old world became the gods of the new world. Figures whose actions, motivations, and teachings were slowly forgotten and replaced by the need for something greater. Consider the Greek myths, where gods like Prometheus or Zeus were once mortal figures who played pivotal roles in the survival of their civilizations. Over time, their stories became less about their personal deeds and more about their symbolic roles in shaping the world. Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, was not originally a divine being. He was a survivor, a figure who helped humanity learn how to survive. Yet over time he became more god than man, elevated to a divine status as his story grew. The same process occurred in other mythologies. In the Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki, once considered wise and knowledgeable beings who guided humanity, became deified over generations. In Egypt, gods like Osiris, who were once the rulers and leaders of the living, transformed into divine figures who had the power to rule both life and death. These figures were not divine at the start of their stories. They were survivors, leaders who carried with them the knowledge of a lost civilization. But over time, as those who remembered them died out, their deeds were elevated to the level of cosmic importance. How long does it take for a remarkable human to become a god? In the case of these survivors, it took generations, centuries, even to transform from figures of history into divine archetypes. The survivors' human qualities were exaggerated, their actions magnified, and their teachings turned into sacred laws. In this way, myth and history became inseparable, with the line between human and God blurred beyond recognition. The transformation from human to divine is also a process of collective memory. What began as a story of survival, of knowledge passed from those who knew how to rebuild, became a story of divine wisdom. Over time, as myths spread across cultures and were told and retold, these figures became the gods we know today. The survivors' wisdom, their leadership, and their guidance were gradually absorbed into the mythic structure, turning them from human figures into immortal beings who could never be questioned or forgotten. The gods, then, were not divine beings who descended from the heavens. They were humans, survivors of a lost world who had guided humanity through the dark days of its rebirth. Their deification was not a result of their innate powers, but of humanity's need for leadership and meaning in the wake of catastrophe. They became gods, not because they were born divine, but because their knowledge and their actions were so extraordinary that they could no longer be seen as mortal. In the next section, we will explore how these gods were further reinterpreted by later civilizations who adopted their stories for political and spiritual purposes. As the survivors became mythic figures, their influence extended beyond survival into the realms of religion and power. How did these divine figures shape the political and spiritual systems of later societies? The answer lies in how myths, once rooted in human experience, evolved into tools of governance and control. As civilizations began to rebuild after the fall, they not only rebuilt their physical structures, but also restructured their cultural systems that relied heavily on the myths of the survivors. These early stories, originally grounded in human experience, were soon adapted, edited, and reshaped to fit the needs of emerging kingdoms, dynasties, and religious institutions. The once human survivors, whose stories had been passed down as practical guidance for rebuilding civilization, were slowly transformed into immortal gods. No longer mere survivors of a lost world, they became cosmic rulers, divine figures whose stories were rewritten to legitimize new political structures and moral codes. This transformation was not just a product of imagination or mythic exaggeration. It was a conscious effort to reframe the past in ways that supported the present. Kings, priesthoods, and empires found it convenient to align their rule with the gods, claiming that their divine status granted them the right to govern. In doing so, the original histories of the survivors were buried beneath layers of theology, rewritten to serve political agendas and the spiritual needs of new societies. For example, the gods of Egypt, such as Osiris and Horus, were originally deified figures who carried with them the wisdom of survival from a lost civilization. Over time, their stories were molded into divine archetypes that justified the power of the pharaohs. The pharaoh, considered to be a living god, was seen as the direct descendant of these gods, their divine rule sanctioned by celestial forces. In this reinterpretation, the pharaoh's authority was not just political, it was cosmic, supported by the ancient gods who had once ruled the world. The story of Osiris, originally a figure who had brought knowledge and wisdom to humanity, became a myth of death and resurrection, a cycle that echoed the political and spiritual renewal brought about by the pharaoh's rule. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, the Sumerian gods like Enki and Inanna were once remembered as wise survivors, the teachers of agriculture, astronomy, and governance. But as the centuries passed, their stories evolved into grand tales of divine kingship, with gods ruling over the heavens and the earth. The concept of kingship became intertwined with divinity. Rulers were seen as the earthly representatives of gods, their power absolute, their decisions unchallenged. The early human origins of these gods were obscured by layers of divine authority, and what had once been a tale of survival transformed into one of celestial power and cosmic rule. In Greece, the gods of Olympus, Zeus, Hera, and Poseidon became the symbols of divine authority, their myths reflecting the political realities of the Greek city-states. The gods were no longer simply the survivors of a lost civilization. They were transformed into divine rulers who governed the cosmos according to their will. The human traits of these gods, jealousy, love, revenge, became symbolic of the power struggles between the city-states themselves. The stories of the gods were adapted to reflect the complex and often ruthless nature of Greek politics, where gods were not just distant, omnipotent beings, but powerful figures whose actions could influence the fate of entire nations. This transformation of human survivors into gods was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate process of reinterpretation. Every empire, every kingdom, every society that embraced these myths reshaped them to fit their own political and spiritual needs. The original human identities of these gods were lost to time, obscured by layers of divine narrative that served to elevate the rulers of the present. The survivors of the ancient world, once ordinary people who had simply survived, became cosmic figures whose stories were rewritten and retold as a means of justifying the rule of those who came after them. In this way, the gods became tools of political power. Their stories were no longer about survival or the preservation of ancient knowledge. They became symbolic representations of the authority of kings, priests, and rulers, whose reigns were legitimized by their connection to these divine beings. What had once been a story of human resilience, of people who endured unimaginable destruction, became a story of divine right, of rulers whose power was seen as ordained by the heavens. The human origins of these gods were gradually erased from the collective memory. Over time, the mythologies became more abstract, more symbolic, until the gods were no longer remembered as survivors of a lost world. They were simply gods, immortal, omnipotent, and removed from the struggles of the human world. The real stories, the struggles, the sacrifices, the efforts to rebuild civilization were lost in the fog of divine mythology. What remained was a divine narrative, one that served not only to explain the cosmos, but also to support the political and spiritual structures of the societies that revered these gods. It's important to recognize that this process of deification wasn't just about elevating individuals. It was about creating a system of belief that justified and supported the present. The gods of ancient civilizations were not the product of spontaneous religious inspiration. They were carefully constructed figures, shaped to fit the needs of a new world. These gods became symbols of order, authority, and divine right, and in doing so, they became the bedrock of the civilizations that followed. By the time these myths reached classical civilizations, the survivors had long since become immortal beings, their true identities lost beneath centuries of adaptations. The process of myth-making, of taking human figures and transforming them into gods, was not a simple act of storytelling. It was a way of ensuring the survival of political and religious systems, a way of embedding divine authority into the fabric of society. What began as human stories of survival and knowledge became divine tales of power and control. What if every empire rewrote the past to hide the human origins of its gods? The answer, it seems, is that they did. The gods were not born from divine realms, but from the memories of those who had lived through a cataclysmic event and had carried the wisdom of a lost civilization with them. Over time, the need for survival and leadership turned these survivors into deities, whose real stories were transformed into divine myths that supported the rise of empires and kingdoms. With the mythic transformation of these survivors complete, we now turn our attention to the remnants of the lost technologies they carried with them. In the next chapter, we will explore how the knowledge of these survivors was passed down, not just in stories, but in the very tools and techniques they left behind. Tools that, though misunderstood by later generations, might hold the key to understanding the advanced civilization that once existed. What remains of their technology, and how did it shape the future of humanity? The answers lie in the forgotten artifacts and inventions of a lost age. In the aftermath of the cataclysm, as survivors began to piece together their new world, they carried with them remnants of the old civilization, tools, devices, and technologies that were far beyond the understanding of those who had never witnessed such advancements. These objects, though simple by today's standards, must have seemed nothing short of miraculous to the people who first encountered them. The survivors, armed with knowledge of a lost age, would have been seen as possessors of strange and divine powers. Their tools, now viewed as sacred relics, became the symbols of divine intervention in a world that had long since forgotten the sophistication of the past. Take, for example, a simple device, like a compass. To an ancient people who had no concept of magnetic forces, the ability to navigate using the stars and the Earth's magnetic field would seem like an incredible, otherworldly gift. A compass capable of guiding travelers across vast distances would surely be interpreted as a divine pointer, a tool gifted by the gods to lead humanity back on course. Similarly, a simple reflective object, perhaps a piece of polished metal or glass, might have been mistaken for a scrying mirror, used to see the future or communicate with the divine. What was once a rudimentary optical device became a sacred artifact, its original purpose completely obscured by the passage of time. The healing arts, too, would have been seen as miraculous. Imagine a simple salve made from herbs and metals that had been honed through trial and error by survivors of a collapsed world. To those who had never seen such remedies, these healing potions would have appeared divine. Medicines gifted by gods to restore life to a broken world. What was once a practical scientific understanding of medicine became transformed into the stuff of myth, with the healers of the past elevated to divine status. These objects, though simple by modern standards, represented the very lifeline for humanity's survival after the fall. They were the tools that enabled the survivors to rebuild what had been lost, guiding them through dangerous landscapes, healing their wounded, and providing the knowledge necessary to carry on. But to those who had not seen the advancements of the old world, these tools must have seemed like magic. They lacked the framework to understand how such objects worked, and so they attributed them to supernatural forces. The technology of a lost civilization carried across deserts, mountains, and seas became sacred relics, imbued with the divine power of the gods. Consider a piece of metal alloy, a material that was stronger and more durable than anything the ancient world had known. In a world that had just emerged from catastrophe, where survival depended on the most basic of tools, a weapon or tool made from this metal would have been seen as a divine weapon. The knowledge of metallurgy, so advanced that it was incomprehensible to those who lived in the aftermath of a collapse, became mythologized. The sword or shield made from this metal became a symbol of divine power, its creator not just a skilled craftsman, but a godlike figure capable of forging weapons that could vanquish any foe. As these tools and artifacts were passed down through generations, their origins were gradually forgotten. The survivors who had once used these devices as practical tools for rebuilding their world became distant figures, their human identities lost to time. The objects they had carried, tools for survival, healing, and navigation, were transformed into sacred relics, their true purposes obscured by the passage of time and the evolution of myth. These objects, once symbols of human ingenuity, became icons of divine power, their original scientific origins forgotten. This process is not unique to ancient civilizations, it happens in cultures throughout history. When knowledge gaps exist, when technology surpasses the understanding of a society, the result is often the creation of myths and legends to explain the unknown. In the case of the survivors, their advanced technology, though based on practical knowledge, became the foundation of religious beliefs, and the tools they carried became symbols of divine intervention. A simple navigation tool was no longer just a device for finding direction. It became a divine instrument guiding humanity's path. A healing salve, once a remedy born of necessity, became a potion given by the gods to restore life, and weapons forged from advanced alloys became divine swords, capable of cutting through the very fabric of reality itself. As generations passed, these objects were absorbed into religious iconography, becoming central symbols in the worship of gods who had once walked the earth. The tools themselves, now imbued with mythical power, were often enshrined in temples or passed down as relics of the divine. The survivors' identities, once clear and human, faded into myth, their tools transformed into holy relics. What was once an object of survival became an object of veneration, its purpose no longer to sustain life, but to symbolize the divine power that the survivors had once wielded. This gradual process of mythologization highlights the human need for symbolic leadership in the face of chaos and uncertainty. In a world that had been torn apart by disaster, the survivors' knowledge became the bedrock upon which new societies were built. But as those societies evolved, they transformed their saviors into gods, elevating their tools and technologies to divine status. The relics of the old world, once simple tools of survival, became the sacred symbols of a new, divine order. As you consider this transformation, imagine the survivors carrying these relics from one settlement to the next, teaching people how to survive, how to heal, and how to navigate the broken world. With each new encounter, their tools and knowledge were seen as more than just practical aids. They were the instruments of gods, capable of restoring a broken world to order. The survivors, in their humanity, became gods in the eyes of those who had never seen the world they had once known. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, became the foundation of myth, and their tools became the miracles that were passed down as divine gifts. The next section will examine how these survivors encoded even more complex knowledge, astronomy, navigation, and cosmic cycles, into star maps and calendars, preserving the wisdom of a lost civilization for future generations. These tools, though originally created for practical purposes, would become the sacred frameworks upon which entire cultures built their understanding of the universe. What began as practical knowledge passed down by survivors became the foundation of cosmological systems, and their celestial insights would shape the myths and religious beliefs of the cultures that followed. When we look up at the night sky, we see a vast expanse, full of stars, planets, and constellations, an ever-present reminder of the mysteries of the cosmos. But for the ancient civilizations that came before us, the sky was not just something to marvel at, it was a map. They studied the heavens with astonishing precision, tracking the movements of stars, planets, and celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. Yet, some of the calendar systems and star charts they developed seem far too advanced for their time. How could these early societies, which were just beginning to form after a global catastrophe, possess the astronomical knowledge necessary to track cycles that spanned thousands of years, much longer than their own existence as organized societies? The answer might lie in the survivors of a lost civilization, those who had lived through the collapse of the old world and carried with them the cosmic understanding that had been developed over millennia. These survivors, though scarred by catastrophe, were the bearers of ancient knowledge. They carried star maps and calendars, charts that had been created by a civilization long forgotten, a civilization that had studied the heavens for ages, perhaps even before the world was torn apart. As they traveled across the earth, these survivors brought with them the wisdom of the skies, passing down the secrets of cosmic cycles to those they encountered. But to the people of the New World, these teachings were not understood as knowledge. They were seen as divine wisdom. The survivors' advanced understanding of the stars, their ability to predict the movements of celestial bodies, and their knowledge of cosmic cycles were interpreted as gifts from the gods. These survivors, with their wisdom of the heavens, became mythologized over time. Their teachings transformed into divine cosmologies and creation myths. One of the most striking examples of this celestial knowledge is found in the ancient Mayan calendar. The Mayans, known for their remarkable advancements in mathematics and astronomy, developed a calendar system that tracked cosmic cycles with incredible precision. Their long count calendar, for instance, is based on a cycle of 5,125.36 years, an astronomical period so long that it exceeds the existence of their civilization. How could they have known to track such an extensive period? The answer may lie in the idea that this knowledge was carried to them by survivors of the lost civilization, those who had studied the skies long before the Mayans ever existed. Similarly, the ancient Egyptians built their great pyramids with precise astronomical alignments, particularly with the stars of Orion, S-belt. The pyramids were not only tombs but were designed as a gateway to the heavens, reflecting the Egyptians' deep understanding of the cosmos. The alignment of these structures with the stars suggests that the builders had an advanced knowledge of celestial mechanics. But how did they acquire this knowledge? Could it have been passed down by survivors who had once lived in a world where astronomy was studied, not just as a way to understand the seasons, but as a way to understand the very fabric of the universe itself? In the ancient Sumerian civilization, the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens, were credited with bringing knowledge of the stars and the cosmos to humanity. The Sumerians' detailed records of the movement of the planets, particularly their observations of the planet Venus, reveal a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles. These records were not the product of a primitive society stumbling upon astronomical knowledge. Instead, they were the work of a civilization that had inherited this knowledge from survivors of a world that had once been far more advanced. The same pattern appears in many ancient cultures. The Babylonians, the Greeks, and even the early Chinese civilizations all possessed detailed astronomical records, many of which are far more advanced than what we would expect from societies with limited technologies. These cultures studied the stars and planets with remarkable precision, observing celestial events such as eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments, long before modern telescopes were even conceived. How did these civilizations know to track such events, and how did they create such accurate systems of timekeeping? It is likely that the knowledge was passed down from those who had inherited it from a lost civilization, one that had studied the heavens with unparalleled depth. What we call myths today might have been the means through which these ancient survivors encoded their astronomical knowledge. In the myths of gods and heroes, we often find references to celestial bodies, planets, stars, and constellations. The gods, it seems, were not simply divine beings but were representations of the celestial bodies they had studied. The myth of the Greek Titan Atlas, for example, who was condemned to hold up the heavens, might be a symbolic reflection of the ancient knowledge of the stars and their movements. Similarly, the Egyptian goddess Nut, whose body arches over the earth, symbolizing the sky, could represent the celestial dome that the Egyptians studied in great detail. Many ancient creation myths also reflect the knowledge of cosmic cycles. In the Hindu tradition, for example, the creation and destruction of the universe occur in vast cycles, each lasting billions of years. These cycles correspond to the ages of the universe, a concept that mirrors modern scientific theories about the life cycle of stars and galaxies. How could ancient people have come to understand such vast cycles without the advanced knowledge of astronomy that seems to have been lost after the fall of a previous civilization? These ancient civilizations, using the mythic language of gods, encoded their observations of astronomical events and cosmic cycles into their stories. What we interpret today as myths, tales of gods, cosmic battles, and divine interventions may in fact be a record of an ancient civilization's attempts to make sense of the cosmos. The celestial knowledge encoded in these myths would have been passed down by survivors, who used storytelling as a way to preserve the knowledge of the stars for future generations. Over time, these teachings became transformed into divine cosmologies, their original scientific roots buried beneath layers of mythology. How did ancient cultures know the sky better than civilizations that came thousands of years later? The answer may lie in the survivors of a lost world who carried the knowledge of the heavens with them as they traveled across the earth. These survivors, though no longer gods, became the teachers of the stars. Their astronomical knowledge, misunderstood by later cultures, became the foundation for the creation myths, cosmologies, and religious systems that would shape the future of humanity. In the next chapter, we will explore the remnants of the lost technologies carried by these survivors, examining how their tools and inventions might have been mistaken for miracles by those who came after them. From star maps to engineering marvels, these technologies were not only misunderstood, they were revered, and their origins became the stuff of legend. As the centuries passed, and the survivors of the Great Collapse slowly integrated into the emerging human societies, their influence began to fade into the background. Over time, the knowledge they carried, once a lifeline in a fractured world, became diluted, absorbed by the broader tapestry of human history. The survivors themselves, once distinct in their abilities and wisdom, gradually blended into the populations they had helped to rebuild. Yet, despite this blending, subtle traces of their legacy remained, whispers of a lost civilization that, though forgotten, still coursed through the veins of humanity. Consider the legends of demigods, noble bloodlines, and chosen families said to be descendants of the gods. These stories, so common across cultures, might have once described real families, those who had inherited knowledge from the survivors of the old world. The divine status attributed to these bloodlines could be seen as a distorted memory of the extraordinary survivors, whose knowledge of agriculture, medicine, architecture, and astronomy had shaped the foundation of early societies. As generations passed, these families, with their revered knowledge, became mythologized as the descendants of gods, their human origins lost to time. The lineage of these families, whether claimed by kings in Egypt, emperors in Mesopotamia, or chieftains in the Americas, was often tied to the divine or celestial. But what if these stories were not fabrications, but echoes of real histories, reminders of those who had carried the flame of a lost civilization into the future? These divine bloodlines may not have been blessed with supernatural abilities, but they were the inheritors of knowledge, the ones who held the keys to survival in a world that had once been broken. Over generations, this knowledge faded, but its influence persisted, woven into the art, traditions, and rituals of the societies that followed. The very symbols, customs, and ideas that we now see as foundational to ancient cultures may be remnants of the knowledge passed down from these survivors. Consider how ancient Egypt's religious symbols, its mythologies, and its monumental architecture reflect a deep understanding of the cosmos, time, and human existence. These weren't just expressions of spiritual belief, they were ways of encoding knowledge passed down from those who had once studied the heavens, built great structures, and understood the cycles of the earth. The pyramids, for instance, were not just tombs, they were aligned with the stars, built with an astronomical precision that spoke to a level of knowledge far beyond the time in which they were created. Could these be remnants of a much older world, carried through generations and embedded into the culture of those who inherited them? Similarly, the creation myths of cultures across the globe, whether in Sumer, Greece, the Americas, or India, speak of gods descending from the sky, teaching humanity how to survive, how to build, how to navigate the world. These stories, though seen as mythological today, may be based on real events. The survivors, who had been the gods of their time, were seen as divine because of the extraordinary knowledge they possessed. Their descendants, in turn, were often regarded as special, chosen, or blessed. Their survival skills, passed down through generations, became the foundation for the cultures that would rise after the fall. Even as the descendants of these survivors blended into society, the stories of their forebears became legendary. Kings and leaders of ancient cultures often claimed divine descent to legitimize their rule. The rulers of Egypt, for example, were often believed to be direct descendants of the gods, their right to rule sanctioned by the heavens. But what if these claims were not entirely unfounded? What if the kings, priests, and warriors who claimed divine heritage were actually the descendants of those who had survived the fall, and had carried the knowledge of the old world into the future. Over time, these real stories of survival, leadership, and wisdom became intertwined with divine mythology, obscured by layers of time, but still present in the bloodlines of those who held power. These bloodlines and noble families were not just symbols of power, they were the keepers of ancient knowledge. They were the ones who understood the land, the stars, and the cycles of nature. Wisdom that had been passed down from the survivors who had rebuilt civilization. And as the centuries passed, this knowledge became embedded in the very fabric of society, passed down not just through royal decrees but through the arts, traditions, and spiritual practices that defined these cultures. What if the legacy of the gods still flows through humanity today? The descendants of the survivors, those who carried the knowledge of a lost civilization, may not have been gods, but they were the bearers of wisdom that has shaped the course of human history. Their influence, though invisible, still lingers in the ways we build, govern, and interpret the world around us. The knowledge that was once encoded in the stories of gods and heroes has been passed down through generations, subtly influencing the development of societies across the globe. The mythic transformation of these survivors is not just a historical curiosity. It is a reflection of humanity's ongoing need for meaning and leadership. In the face of disaster and uncertainty, we look to the past for guidance, and when we find none, we create it. We elevate our ancestors to divine status, not because they were supernatural, but because they were the survivors who gave us the tools to rebuild. Their legacy lives on in the traditions we still hold dear, in the rituals we perform, and in the myths we tell. These stories are more than just the foundation of our cultures. They are the threads that connect us to a forgotten world, a world that may have been lost, but whose influence continues to shape us today. As we reach the final chapter of this exploration, we will reflect on the remnants of these lost civilizations, asking the ultimate question: what happened to the descendants of the survivors? Did they continue to preserve the knowledge of the old world, or did they too fall into obscurity? And what lessons can we learn from the past that can guide us in the future? The answers may lie in the very foundation of our modern world, in the ways we continue to preserve and transform the knowledge of those who came before us. As we come to the end of our journey through this forgotten chapter of human history, it becomes clear that the myths, monuments, and teachings passed down by the survivors of a lost civilization have shaped much of the world we know today. These remnants of the past, once thought to be nothing more than tales of gods and heroes, have influenced the foundations of religions, sciences, and cultural identity for millennia. What we once believed to be supernatural acts of divine intervention may have, in truth, been the surviving knowledge of a more advanced civilization. A civilization that, in its final days, sought not only to survive, but to preserve its knowledge for future generations. These survivors, whose lives were defined by unimaginable loss and struggle, became the legends that guided the next world. Their knowledge of the stars, of agriculture, of medicine and architecture, once practical tools for rebuilding, transformed into the sacred teachings of gods. Over generations, their human identity faded, and the gods they once were mythologized, their real stories obscured by layers of time and transformation. Yet the influence of their survival, of their resilience, can still be felt in the ancient monuments we marvel at, in the stories we tell, and in the systems we've built upon their wisdom. What if, in fact, the gods were not supernatural beings, but simply humans, just like us, facing the unimaginable loss of their world, trying desperately to preserve what remained and guide the next generation? Perhaps the stories of divine beings descending from the sky were not just allegories, but echoes of those who once lived through a cataclysmic event, carrying with them the keys to a lost world. What if the gods we've worshipped for millennia were, in fact, the survivors of an ancient civilization, not unlike our own, desperately trying to rebuild in a world that had been shattered? As we reflect on this possibility, it raises a deeper, more personal question. If such a civilization existed once, could it happen again? What would we, the people of today, leave behind if our world were to end? Would our stories be remembered as legends, our knowledge preserved as divine wisdom? Or would we be forgotten, our civilization lost to the sands of time? If future generations were to look back at us, would they see us as mere mortals, or as gods, elevated in myth by the survivors of a world we once knew? If our world ended tomorrow, what stories would survivors tell about us? Would they remember our achievements, our knowledge, and our resilience? Or would they, like us, struggle to comprehend the world that came before them. The narrative of survival, of memory, and of myth is an ongoing process. Every generation reinterprets the past, creating the stories that shape the future. And as we look at the ancient myths, we are reminded that the line between history and legend is often far thinner than we think. Perhaps we will never know the full truth of what happened to the survivors of that lost civilization, but their stories, woven into the fabric of our own, invite us to reconsider the very nature of myth, memory, and human history. The gods may not have been divine, but they were certainly extraordinary. They were the ones who survived, who carried the knowledge of a lost world and used it to guide the next. And in doing so, they became immortal, not because of their supernatural abilities, but because their stories, their teachings, and their survival lived on. As we close this chapter of exploration, I invite you to hold two truths at once: the beauty of myth and the possibility of forgotten history. There are mysteries yet to be uncovered, questions that remain unanswered, and stories waiting to be told. Our own place in history is still being written, and the future may one day look back on us as a part of an ongoing cycle of survival, reinvention, and myth. The tapestry of human history is far from complete. There is always more to discover, always more to learn. The mysteries we explore today may one day be the legends of tomorrow. And so, as we fade out from this journey, I leave you with this. As we look toward the future, ask yourself, how will future generations remember us? Will they see us as humans, flawed and finite, or as gods, the remnants of a civilization that once changed the world? The answer may lie not in the stories we tell now, but in the legacy we leave behind.